Midnight. Smoke stings the eyes. Your breath fogs in the dim glow of a single central fire. Around you, the low hum of dozens of bodies, the scrape of a bench, the snort of an animal, the soft exhale of a sleeping child, mixes with the steady, damp thud of turf and sod pressing down on the roof. Outside, the world is a black wall of cold. Inside, the longhouse exhales warmth. How did people living here not only survive those winters, but in many places thrive? They did not survive by chance. They engineered survival as a whole system. Architecture, animals, food economies, and social customs were braided together so tightly that the house itself became a living strategy, a passive thermal store warmed by the bodies beneath its rafters. That is the hidden strategy we will follow. How the Viking longhouse functioned as a thermal battery, and what the price of that design really was. If this story grabs you, subscribe for more deep dives into historical engineering and survival. The cold that shaped these choices was not merely a seasonal inconvenience. Paleoclimate reconstructions show a shift in the medieval period toward greater seasonality and, in many northern reaches, lower mean temperatures, regional averages dipping by roughly a degree Celsius, with winters that cut deeper and for longer. What matters in human terms is not the mean alone, but extremes and the margin of safety. For a farming household dependent on the accumulation of calories between one harvest and the next, the seasonal equation is stark. Gather enough in 6 months to survive the next 6. Fail at storage, and the consequence is not discomfort, but famine. That survival math pushes societies to design buffers. In the Viking world, the longhouse was the fundamental buffer. It is easy to dismiss a turf-roofed, timber-framed building as a crude shelter, but when archaeologists excavate sites like Borg on the island of Vestvågøy in northern Norway, the massive structure whose footprint stretches anomalously long across the landscape, they find an architecture of precision and scale. Borg, dated to the Viking Age, measures in tens of meters and preserves traces of a 3-aisle plan, a central living corridor flanked by benches, and beyond them, animal stalls and storage. The walls are not mere windbreaks. Thick turf cladding bound to a timber frame, a sod roof layered over birch bark, a packed earth floor that holds its shape underfoot. Each material contributes to thermal performance in distinct ways. To understand the longhouse as a thermal system, it helps to imagine it in 2 modes: the slow physics of mass and the fast physics of metabolism. Heavy materials, packed earth, thick turf, stacked stones, absorb heat when the interior warms and release it slowly as temperatures fall. That property is called thermal mass. Think of it like a battery. The house charges when heat is available and discharges through the night.
But this battery is neither electrical nor closed. It is active, charged not only by the sun and stored peat, but by living bodies. At the center of the longhouse sits the hearth, an open fire that punctuates the interior with light and a focal point for cooking, drying, metalworking, and social life. The hearth delivers high-temperature heat needed for tasks that require flames. But for year-round, steady warmth, the crucial source was metabolic, the heat produced by animals and humans. An adult human at rest produces a modest, steady output, roughly on the order of tens of watts, enough to keep fingers from freezing, but not to warm a large stone and turf volume. Cattle, on the other hand, are thermal machines. Experimental reconstructions of animal metabolism combined with physiological estimates place an adult cow's heat output in the ballpark of over 1,000 watts under typical winter activity, on the order of magnitude that an entire small household of people cannot match. In practice, archaeozoological analysis and soil chemistry at many sites show intentional proximity between people and their livestock, stalls opening directly into the living shell, bedding areas abutting animal pens, waste layers and chemical signatures concentrated where animals lived under the same roof. The arrangement is purposeful. Animals housed beneath the same eaves are both economic assets and heat batteries. Their bodies give off low-grade continuous warmth. Their presence raises the baseline interior temperature even when the hearth dies down. Floors packed with earth and stone absorb that heat during the day and release it at night. Turf, with its fibrous root matrix and trapped air pockets, acts as an insulating and thermally stabilizing layer. Even a single degree of sustained warmth can be the difference between a household surviving a cold snap and losing livestock, stores, or people. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation beyond architectural geometry. Chemical analyses of floor sediments in sites such as Lothar reveal elevated concentrations of phosphate and nitrogenous compounds, signatures consistent with prolonged animal occupation and organic waste. These soil chemistry patterns, when spatially correlated with structural remains, map the longhouse's internal logic. Human benches and sleeping boxes nearest the central corridor, animal aisles tucked to the side but within the building envelope, storage and workshop spaces at the ends. That zoning concentrates heat where it is most needed and minimizes the volume that must be kept above freezing. But the system is more than a matter of bones, sod, and urine traces. Experimental archaeology, the painstaking recreation of longhouse conditions and controlled trials, has made the invisible visible. Teams have rebuilt longhouse sections using period-appropriate materials and stoked hearths while cohabiting with livestock to capture temperature gradients, humidity, and air quality over time.
They have measured how packed earth floors vary by the hour, how thermal inertia smooths diurnal swings, and how much baseline warmth the bodies of animals provide over a sustained winter week. In those reconstructions, the interplay between long-duration storage of heat in mass and continuous metabolic input becomes tangible. When animals are present, interior temperatures stabilize several degrees higher than similarly constructed empty spaces, and the stored heat in packed floors remains perceptible through long, cold nights. This is where the phrase thermal battery earns its weight. It is not a metaphor to suggest equivalence with modern systems, but a concise way to describe an engineered exchange. Heavy materials store heat, living bodies provide steady charging, the hearth supplies peaks. The house thus becomes an ecosystem that smooths scarcity across time, turning fleeting summer solar gain, the fall harvest, and the constant heat of livestock into a survivable winter climate within the envelope. Design choices follow from that logic. The longhouse is long for reasons beyond social arrangement. A stretched plan produces zones of use and microclimates. The center concentrates heat and activity. The edges are cooler, but serve storage and work functions. Benches built along the length elevate sleepers above damp floors, reducing heat loss to conduction and keeping bedding drier. Box beds, enclosed sleeping chambers, trap small volumes of air warmed by bodies in bedclothes. Archaeologists have recovered heavy furs, and most strikingly, evidence for down bedding. The Osberg burial, an elite internment discovered with an array of textiles and bedding fragments, contained large quantities of down, suggesting that, at least among high-status individuals, soft, highly insulating bedding was prized. Down, with its trapping of air in tiny clusters, provides insulation far superior to simple wool layering, and in a house where ambient temperatures might be low but not lethal, such bedding converts a small personal microclimate into a comfortable sleeping cell. That personal insulation multiplies the system's efficiency. For example, raised benches work like modern sleeping platforms, less conductive contact with the cold floor, better circulation of warmed air around the body, and a position to soak up some of the radiated warmth from the hearth. Layered garments reduce convective losses, while dense furs and down trap the thin, still air that, in the smoky house, rarely moved far. Anthropological and textile analyses show that North Atlantic populations maintained a sophisticated clothing economy. Multiple layers of wool, often with vegetable or leather components, could be combined to tailor insulation to the night's needs. Yet the system rests on a crucial and morally complex trade-off. To trap heat is often to trap smoke. Open hearths without chimneys are imperfect in their exhaust. They require an envelope that retains heat. The denser that envelope, the less draft occurs, and the more heat stays inside. But tightness increases the concentration of smoke particulates and combustion gases. Experimental reconstructions have quantified this cost. Particulate levels and carbon monoxide readings taken inside replicated longhouses during active hearth use frequently exceed modern health guidelines, sometimes by an order of magnitude or more, depending on ventilation, fuel type, and the number of simultaneous fires. Those figures must be read with nuance. WHO limits are designed for continuous, long-term exposure in modern contexts. The hearths of a longhouse produced variable episodes of high smoke and intervals of lower concentration. Still, repeated exposure to elevated particulate matter is consistent, in medical terms, with increased risk of chronic respiratory conditions. The archaeological record offers further suggestive evidence. Osteological assemblages from some regions show markers one would expect where chronic respiratory stress was common, though preservation biases and multifactorial causation complicate direct lines of attribution. This calculus is key to understanding Viking choices. Framing the longhouse as a purely benevolent technology misses the point. It was an engineering compromise. Households weighed the immediate danger of freezing against the long-term burden of smoke inhalation and made their choice. In a climate where failed storage could mean starvation across a whole year, the acute risk outweighed the chronic. The longhouse represents an explicit decision: accept the chronic, manageable harm of indoor smoke in order to prevent the acute, catastrophic harm of cold exposure to people and animals.
The politics of that choice are visible in the material record. Chimneys appear in some later medieval contexts and in certain high-status buildings, but they are rare in early Viking Age settlements. The physics are simple. A chimney increases draft and thus accelerates heat loss through the roof and walls. In a world where fuel, peat, driftwood, and cut sod was precious, and where repeated refueling could not be guaranteed through long winter storms, losing heat to exhaust was often unaffordable. That is why many houses remain smoky by design. Experimental archaeologists who lived in reconstructed longhouses report a strange adaptation. The smoke itself becomes a feature of life. It acts as insect repellent, helps cure animal hides, preserves wood, and inhibits certain pests in stored food. At the social level, the smoke-shaded interior concentrates activities. People gather close to the hearth for light and warmth. They spin, weave, mend nets, and tell stories in a space that is physically bounded and socially intense. The house, therefore, is not only a thermal device but a cultural condenser, an incubator for skills, memory, and law. But even within this system, people develop techniques to modulate the harm.
They optimized fuels, selecting wood species, adding turf on certain days, or using well-prepared peat that smoldered more than flamed and produced different smoke characteristics. They staged their activities to minimize overlapping high smoke events. For instance, metalwork and heavy cooking might occur in separate parts of the house or during specific times when ventilation was slightly higher. They built bedding that could be sealed, like box beds, to isolate sleepers from ambient particulates for several hours while retaining warmth. These are little acts of adaptation layered upon the broader strategy. The longhouse's internal zoning also reveals a hierarchical logic of risk. Ancient floor plans and residue analyses indicate that the hottest, most smoke-exposed zones were not necessarily where the most vulnerable slept. Children and the elderly often occupied elevated or better insulated areas when possible. High-value livestock might be moved closest to the hearth during extreme cold spells, while lower-value animals were relegated to outer stalls. The micropolitics of space, who slept where, which animals were sheltered nearest the fire, is an insurance policy writ in turf and timber. Yet, even as the architectural and behavioral solutions mitigated risk, they could not eliminate it. The same trade-offs that kept a household alive through a blizzard could erode health across generations. The archaeological and osteological traces are messy and regional. Some communities show more wear and chronic disease markers, while others, perhaps with better access to trade or different fuel economies, display fewer signs. This regional variability reminds us of another constraint. No single Viking solution applies uniformly across a broad geographic and temporal span. Borg in northern Norway differs from small farmsteads in more temperate zones. Coastal fish processing sites had different layouts and needs from inland settlements. Archaeology teaches us to see patterns and to respect exceptions. Still, the system's power lies in its integration. Consider how food economies tie into the thermal logic. Hay is not just feed, it is stored energy that allows animals to be kept under roofs through the lean months. Stockfish, air-dried cod processed on racks exposed to the wind and cold, turns a seasonal glut of fish into a portable, long-lasting commodity that could provision households and feed trade networks. These food buffers reduce the system's vulnerability to individual harvest failure. Where specialized trade links existed, communities could diversify their risk. A fishing outpost might trade preserved fish for grain or textiles, thereby smoothing caloric supply across a region. Conversely, where such links were absent or brittle, households were forced into a tighter reliance on the longhouse's thermal economy. We can glimpse this interdependence in the bones. Zooarchaeology shows different animal herds managed for distinct roles: cattle for dairy and heat, sheep for wool and mid-sized meat, smaller pigs kept for rapid energy return. The spatial depositions in some sites reveal feed storage adjacent to animal bays. Pollen and plant macrofossils indicate concerted hay production in the late summer. In contexts like Greenland, historians have pointed to a different outcome: a more rigid focus on certain resources and a failure to maintain diversified trade or production networks contributed to collapse when the climate turned against them. That contrast underscores how the longhouse's effectiveness depended on its embedding within larger economic and cultural systems. What becomes clear in these cross-cutting lines of evidence is a conceptual shift in how to read the past. Where earlier narratives praised individual toughness or condemned pre-industrial ignorance, the architecture and archaeology reveal a systems-level intelligence. The longhouse is not a primitive mistake.
It is a rational, evidence-based design adapted to a particular set of constraints: fuel availability, climatic severity, animal metabolism, and the imperative to avoid starvation. It is engineering without modern tools, an assemblage of materials and behaviors optimized toward a singular goal: keep enough alive long enough to harvest again. As these threads come together, the mass of turf and earth, the hum of animals, the glow of the hearth, the chemical signature of stall waste, and the texture of down-lined bedding, a picture emerges of survival as deliberate, not accidental. But the picture is incomplete. We have mapped the architecture and started to measure its thermal performance. We have seen the chemical fingerprints that tie animals to living spaces. We have measured smoke and inferred its health consequences. What we have not yet fully traced is how labor and culture within the longhouse converted those physical conditions into social resilience. Evening tasks, spinning, weaving, repairing nets, and sharpening tools, are not mere pastimes under a roof that retains heat. They are the deliberate production of buffers: cloth that functions as insulation, sails that enable trade across dangerous seas, and repaired tools that keep fields productive. The hearth's light is the time and place for transmission. Elders teach the patterns of law and kinship in the warm, smoky circle. Songs and sagas encode knowledge of navigation, medicine, and crop timing. These intangible assets, the know-how and social bonds, are as essential to winter survival as hay and down. To see how these social processes scale, imagine a community through a particularly harsh winter. The hearths burn longer, animals crowd nearer the central trenches, and production shifts toward essentials.
Spindle whorls and loom weights clack in rhythm as women and men increase textile output, not only to clothe family members but to produce trade goods for the spring markets. The longhouse becomes a factory, a school, and a court. Laws are enforced and retold. Disputes that might have erupted in a dispersed settlement are handled within the concentrated space of the hall. In this way, confinement, physical and seasonal, transforms into social coherence. There is more to uncover. We have traced how steady animal heat and heavy thermal mass keep a house alive through a night of cold. We have mapped the compromise that accepts smoky air to avoid freezing. We have begun to see how food preservation and labor economics plug into the architecture. But numbers still wait for finer context. How many animals per household delivered the necessary baseline wattage? How did the interior climate vary by hour, by fuel type, by community size? How did health outcomes change across generations and landscapes? Experimental reconstructions have produced measurements, yet those data must be read against osteological evidence, climatic records, and regional differences. To answer those questions requires stepping back into the smoky glow and listening to the small voices of the past, those left in the spaces between a hearthstone and a bench, in the chemistry of a floor, and in the braided remains of a down mattress. The next layer of the story must bridge thermal physics with daily life measurements, metabolic outputs, particulate concentrations measured against modern standards, and the arithmetic of hay and stockfish that turned short-term abundance into long-term survival. Only then can we name precisely how the hidden strategy operated and what it cost. So we returned to the longhouse at midnight. The hearth guttered for a moment. A cow shifted in its stall, sending a pulse of warmth across the packed floor. The smoke thickened for an instant, and then thinned as a small leak in the sod roof released a column. A woman tucked a child into a box bed lined with down, drew a blanket over the child's face to trap warmth, and returned to the loom. Outside, the wind scoured the turf with a thin crystalline frost. Inside, the house held. The question, how much did this holding demand, and how sustainable was it across generations, is the hinge for the next chapter of investigation. Inside, the house held. The woman tightened the child's blanket and returned to the loom, where the shuttle whispered across the warp. Outside, frost bit the turf. Inside, respiration and embers kept a fragile margin. To move from this image towards precise understanding requires numbers and models, an attempt to translate lived practice into the arithmetic of survival. Experimental reconstructions, osteological studies, soil chemistry, and the distribution of artifacts together allow us to sketch the contours of that arithmetic.
When we do, the hidden strategy finally comes into sharp relief. An intentional orchestration of materials, bodies, stored calories, and social labor that treated the longhouse not as a mere shelter, but as an engineered buffer against a dangerous climate. Start with heat production. Modern physiologists use watts to express how much thermal power a living body emits. Reconstructions and metabolic estimates place a resting adult human in the neighborhood of 70 to 100 watts of continuous output. That is enough to keep fingers from going numb, but it dissipates quickly in a stone and turf shell. A full-grown cow, by contrast, produces steady heat an order of magnitude greater. Experimental estimates used in several reconstructions place a winter-active cow's continuous output at roughly 1,200 to 1,800 watts, depending on size, activity, and ambient temperature. Sheep and goats fall somewhere between humans and cattle, several hundred watts apiece. Pigs vary, often lower than ungulates, but still meaningful. Translate those figures into a household scenario. Take a mid-sized longhouse with a living community of 12 people and a mixed complement of animals, say 3 cattle, a dozen sheep, and 2 pigs. Using conservative mid-range values, the human occupants together might generate around 1,000 watts. The 3 cattle might supply 4,500 watts, the sheep and pigs another 2,000 watts. Suddenly, the animals account for the lion's share of continuous metabolic heat. In reconstructions that explicitly modeled these numbers, researchers found that adding or removing even a single cow materially changed overnight baseline temperatures in the occupied zones. With animals present, thermal inertia in packed floors and turf significantly reduced the frequency with which the hearth needed to be fired to avoid dangerous drops. Remove the animals, and the hearth must be stoked more often. Fuel consumption increases, and the margin for error in a bad winter narrows. Fuel arithmetic tightens the picture. Animals must be fed, and feeding them through a long, dark winter consumes stored plant energy, hay, preserved root crops, and whatever forage can be littled in. Archaeobotanical assemblages from northern sites often show evidence for significant late summer grass cutting and hay deposition, implying that households stored multiple tons of fodder per animal year. That is not a casual undertaking. Cutting, drying, and storing hay at scale requires labor during late summer and autumn, secure storage that resists damp, and a calendar of feeding that conserves the most valuable reserves for the deepest months. In short, keeping animals indoors through winter is itself a form of energy budgeting. You invest stored plant energy in biological heat to reduce fuel and mortality risk.
Stockfish and other preserved marine products perform a parallel function at a different level, turning seasonal abundance into a widely tradable, highly storable calorie reserve that can be mobilized against a bad harvest. These are not abstract choices. At Borg, a massive longhouse complex on Vestvågøy dated to the Viking Age, excavations revealed deliberate zoning, central activity corridors with benches, adjacent animal bays, and discrete work and storage zones at the ends. Soil chemistry from a site like Lotar confirms the narrative. Elevated phosphorus and organic nitrogen concentrations map to the animal zones, showing long-term accumulation consistent with under-roof stalling. The Oseberg burial, an elite grave in which archaeologists recovered abundant textile remains and down fragments, offers a window into the high end of personal insulation technology. Box beds and downlined bedding hint at how elites could amplify the house's baseline warmth to produce localized comfort. Together, these case studies anchor the general model in particular observations. Packed earth and turf are more than passive components. They are thermal devices with measurable behavior. Experimental rebuilds that instrumented floors and berms recorded diurnal damping of temperature swings. Floors absorbed heat during periods of hearth activity and released it slowly over the night, with characteristic decay times on the order of 8 to 24 hours, depending on material depth, density, and moisture content. Turf, with its fibrous matrix, combines insulation with mass. It slows conductive losses to the outside while storing heat in its mineral matrix. The net effect is that the combined influence of thermal mass and animal heat can raise interior baseline temperatures by several degrees Celsius relative to an empty, unmasked structure, enough in climates on the margin to prevent freezing of stored food, stall mortality, and hypothermic risk among sleepers. But this engineered buffer demands trade-offs. The physics of smoke and ventilation are inexorable. An open hearth in a low-roofed longhouse must shed combustion products. Chimneys would have solved exhaust more cleanly, but they also encourage drafts that increase convective heat loss. In a low-fuel economy where peat, driftwood, or limited timber must be stretched across months of continuous winter, the priority in many communities became heat retention at the cost of air quality. Experimental reconstructions quantify the hazard. Particulate concentrations, PM2.5, measured inside occupied reconstructions during active hearth use, have in multiple trials spiked into the hundreds of micrograms per cubic meter during peak activity, far above modern 24-hour guidelines, which are in the low tens of micrograms per cubic meter. Carbon monoxide measurements have shown episodic spikes into the tens or low hundreds of parts per million during high smoke episodes. These are not constant exposures, and they vary by hearth design, fuel, and ventilatory leaks. But cumulative exposure over a lifetime plausibly raises the risk of chronic respiratory illness. Archaeological skeletons speak in a muted tongue. interpretations must be cautious. Bone preserves only certain signals, and many factors, nutrition, infection, workload, affect health markers. Still, some assemblages show elevated markers consistent with chronic stress, respiratory disease indicators in particular contexts, and patterns of healed fractures and joint wear that map to heavy workloads. These traces, paired with reconstructed air quality data, help form a coherent inferential argument. Communities made a deliberate calculation, accepting a certain chronic health burden in exchange for a dramatically improved chance of surviving acute climatic stress. That calculation resonated in social practice. The interior hierarchy of the longhouse was an insurance scheme written into space. High-status sleeping arrangements, box beds, elevated benches, and thicker textiles appear in the archaeological record where status is attested. Ethnographic analogy and historical records from later periods suggest households negotiated sleeping positions strategically. Infants and those whose labor was most needed might be placed in warmer microclimates. The aged and disabled might be given insulated spaces where possible. Animal placement likewise followed a triage logic. Primary dairy cows, critical for ongoing nutritional stability, were sheltered nearest the hearth during severe cold. Others were pushed toward outer stalls where less metabolic heat would contribute to the communal baseline. Winter labor practices intersected directly with these environmental strategies. Textile production is the clearest example. The material record across North Atlantic sites is rich in spindle whorls and loom weights, evidence that spinning and weaving were not sporadic cottage crafts, but organized production activities that intensified in winter. Textiles produced by winter labor served several functions simultaneously: clothing for household use, barter goods for obtaining grain or fuel, and insulative products, socks, caps, blankets, that increased the effective warmth each person could secure with a given ambient temperature. In other words, labor converted time in a warm, occupied hall into products that both improved individual microclimates and smoothed seasonal calories via trade. Experimental comparisons between households with different spindle whorl counts and corresponding estimates of textile output suggest that communities with higher winter production could export more goods in spring, bolstering economic resilience.
This is visible archaeologically. Coastal trading nodes with access to preserved fish and a robust textile output show more diversified assemblages and fewer collapse signals in climatically adverse centuries, whereas isolated settlements that failed to develop exchange networks or diversify production, Greenland's Norse colonies being the often cited example, demonstrated vulnerability when climatic and economic conditions shifted. Stockfish production is a particularly illuminating node in the wider system. Cod caught in summer and fall could be air-dried on racks for months, producing a stable, transportable, calorie-dense product. Archaeological fishbone assemblages and distribution maps show that stockfish was widely traded across the North Atlantic, functioning as currency and as a dietary staple in places that otherwise lacked sufficient grain. The economics matter. Stockfish allowed some communities to import grain, hay, or other commodities in exchange, enabling a redistribution of caloric risk across regions. But stockfish production itself demands infrastructure, racks, labor, and exposure to cold, windy coasts, linking coastal economic specialization to inland thermal strategies. A failure in either link, a ruined drying season, piracy, or trade disruption, could propagate stress inland. One of the paradoxes of the longhouse system is its simultaneous fragility and robustness. It is robust because multiple components, architecture, animals, stored feed, textile labor, social cohesion, reinforce one another. It is fragile because if one node fails badly enough, the entire assembly is strained. The Norse in Greenland illustrate this fragility. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that their economy relied on a narrow suite of resources and trade ties. As the climate cooled and ice conditions changed, hunting and shipping became more precarious, and the rigidities in agricultural practice and diet reduced adaptive capacity. In contrast, communities better integrated into wider trade networks or with more diverse domestic economies could absorb shocks more readily. That brings us to the human experience in the longhouse. It is not enough to say that a system works in aggregate. We must return to the small textures of daily life. Inside the smoky hall, time was structured. Work rhythms, haymaking in summer, feed rationing in midwinter, textile production during the darkest months, were communal efforts. The hearth was a nexus of production and pedagogy. Elders taught knots and measurements. Skilled spinners instructed apprentices. Laws and genealogies were recited in the same breath as instructions for curing hides and smoking fish. The slow, smoky night fostered a concentrative cultural practice. Storytelling and ritual were adaptive technologies. They strengthened social bonds, transmitted procedural knowledge, and reinforced norms of sharing and labor that reduced the likelihood of intra-community collapse. Experimental participants who lived for weeks in reconstructed halls describe a similar social intensification. One field archaeologist reported that the house shapes conversation. You find yourself passing techniques around the hearth, the same space that provides light and warmth. Another observed that the concentration of people and activities simplified coordination. You can fix a net and teach a child in the same breath, and the social memory accumulates in the strain of shared labor. Those brief observations are not romanticizations. They point to a pragmatic mechanism by which cultural capital, skills, norms, reciprocal obligations, becomes a resource in itself. A fuller picture also requires understanding the housekeeping strategies that mitigated smoke exposure. People did not passively inhale whatever drifted through the hall. They adopted behaviors to lower personal doses. Box beds and head coverings reduced particulate contact during sleep. Smoking meat and hides in particular spaces or seasons allowed residents to concentrate higher smoke activities away from sleeping areas. And the timing of metalworking or heavy cooking could be orchestrated to periods when ventilation was temporarily increased, often through opening doors or small roof leaks. Experimental reconstructions that tracked occupant exposure showed that such behavioral mods could produce meaningful reductions in peak exposures for targeted individuals, even if they could not eliminate the overall elevated background. We must also account for social organization beyond the household. Communal storage houses, shared checkpoints for hay and grain, and collective herding arrangements all distributed risk over larger units than a single longhouse. Legal institutions and ceremonial gatherings that occurred in winter, for instance assemblies or feasting days, appear to have been opportunities for redistribution. Grain or fish redistributed to households in need in return for labor or favors, fines converted into resources. These networks function not only as economic exchange, but as social insurance, underwriting the system's stability across seasons and generations. Mathematical models derived from archaeological and ecological data provide a synthetic way to contemplate these dynamics. When modelers combine metabolic heat outputs, thermal mass properties, fuel availability curves, and harvest risk probabilities, a common result emerges. Systems that integrate animal housing, stored feed, and winter productive labor reduce the conditional probability of catastrophic loss in a bad year compared to systems that compartmentalize tasks and shelter animals separately. In probabilistic terms, the integrated longhouse reduces the variance of survival outcomes at the price of shifting some of the expected cost into chronic morbidity and social constraints. That is a sober, realistic trade-off, not evidence of ignorance or brutality.
Naming the hidden strategy in one phrase is now possible. The longhouse functioned as an integrated survival ecosystem, a thermal battery charged by living bodies and summer resources, regulated by an economy of stored calories and winter production, and stabilized by social practices that turned confinement into coordinated labor and cultural reinforcement. It is hidden because its coherence only emerges when multiple lines of evidence, architecture, soil chemistry, zooarchaeology, textile and artifact distributions, paleoclimate data, and experimental reconstructions are read together. Isolated observations hint at parts of the system. Combined, they reveal a deliberate design. What lessons does this synthesis offer beyond historical curiosity? For designers and engineers, the Viking longhouse is a cautionary example of systems thinking applied under constraint. It shows the power of using every available asset, materials, living systems, human labor, to create resilience. It also demonstrates the moral and health costs that may be embedded in seemingly efficient solutions. For modern survivalists and architects inspired by vernacular ingenuity, the message is mixed. Mimic the principle, integrating passive thermal mass with locally available heat sources and designing for multi-use spaces, but respect differences in contemporary health standards and resource regimes. Chimneys and modern ventilation can preserve the thermal benefits of mass while reducing chronic exposure. Modern insulation materials can replace the smoke-serving functions without repeating past harms. In short, the longhouse teaches the value of thinking in systems while reminding us to measure both immediate benefits and cumulative costs. Historically, the longhouse's story also reframes narratives of decline or collapse. Where isolated failure occurred, it was usually not because people lacked ingenuity, but because external conditions, trade interruption, resource depletion, or abrupt climatic shifts overran the balancing act. Conversely, where communities adapted by diversifying resources, fostering trade, or innovating incremental changes like more efficient fuel use or altered sleeping arrangements, the longhouse strategy retained its usefulness longer.
The lesson is not that the past was better or worse. It is that resilience depends on flexibility, diversity, and the willingness to negotiate trade-offs. The Longhouse ends, finally, in the lived choices of people, deciding who slept nearest the hearth, how many animals to shelter indoors, which fuel to burn, which nets to mend through the night, and which stories to teach the children before sleep. Those choices produced measurable outcomes at the household and community levels, outcomes we can now detect in microchemistry, bone chemistry, tool assemblages, and experimental temperature logs. The hidden strategy was never purely architectural or purely economic or purely social.
It was, in the tightest sense, integrative. If you want to follow one thread further, consider the military analog hinted at elsewhere. Soldiers in frozen foxholes during 20th century campaigns confronted a similar arithmetic: short-term survival versus chronic exposure risks, the need to balance shelter, body heat, and fuel, and the social dimensions of mutual care under stress. Our next recommended episode explores that parallel in detail: how World War II soldiers survived frozen foxholes, and what their experience reveals about constrained engineering under fire. It traces a different technological epoch, but echoes the same system's logic. For now, the Longhouse closes its thin column of smoke into the night. The child breathes warm. The hearth keeps a patient flame. Outside, winter presses its advantage. Inside, knowledge, how to spin, how to stitch, how to trade, how to tend a cow, passes in a steady stream from one pair of hands to another. The Viking solution to brutal winters was not a single invention, but a braided strategy. Store heat in stone and turf, charge it with living bodies, economize fuel, preserve calories, and convert confinement into coordinated labor and memory. That integrated design kept people alive long enough to plant again, sail again, and tell the next story. If the price was chronic smoke and the slow wear of lungs, the choice is visible in the record, but not reducible to a single judgment. It is the story of adaptation in a harsh world. If this reconstruction of a hidden strategy of survival resonated with you, watch the linked episode on soldiers in frozen foxholes to see how similar constraints shaped a different age of engineering, and subscribe to catch more episodes where archaeology, physics, and human stories meet.